The first fake invoice showed up in a crumpled envelope duct taped to my fence post. No postage, no return address. Just a single sheet of paper that read, HOA Environmental Impact Fee $325 due immediately. I own a small farm on the edge of Maple Hollow, a sleepy, mostly rural neighborhood that somehow got roped into an HOA a few years ago when the city rezoned half the area. My land was grandfathered in. I don't use HOA services. I've got goats, chickens, and a busted tractor I've been threatening to fix for 5 years. But apparently that wasn't good enough for Judith Marlowe, our HOA vice president and full-time neighborhood tyrant. Judith was exactly what you'd expect. Bleach blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, yoga pants she never actually did yoga in, and an obsession with bylaws. She once tried to write up my neighbor for planting non-compliant daisies. No joke. I'm Jackson Grady. I fix fences, grow tomatoes, and mind my own business. But when Judith started sending me fake invoices, I knew something was off. I walked the crumpled paper up to my kitchen, flopped it on the counter, and looked it over. It wasn't even a real letterhead. The HOA logo was pixelated like someone pulled it from a Google image search. The font, Comic Sans, I laughed, tossed it aside, and moved on. But then the second one came. This time she claimed I owed $475 for unauthorized water usage. I have a well, there's no water bill, and the kicker. She signed it herself. Judith Marlowe, HOA Vice President and Environmental Compliance Officer. That title didn't even exist. I marched straight down to the HOA office, which was really just her converted garage with one of those fake ficus plants in the corner. She was sitting behind a desk like she was running the Pentagon. "Judith," I said, holding up the invoice, "what exactly is this?" She barely looked up. "That's your environmental fee, Mr. Grady. Farms like yours increase runoff and strain our shared resources. We don't share anything." "I'm not part of your HOA. You live within the boundary, don't you? My property was excluded when the agreement was signed. You know that." She adjusted her glasses and gave me that smug, condescending smile she always wore when she was about to say something outrageous. "Well, I've updated the maps. You're part of it now. Retroactive fees apply. You can't just redraw property lines because you feel like it." She tapped on her laptop and said, "You're welcome to file a complaint. In the meantime, payment is due." I left before I said something I'd regret, but I snapped a quick photo of her screen when she turned to answer her phone, and that's when I saw it 6 fake invoices made out to other rural homeowners. Same amounts, same phony reasons. She was running a side hustle, and she was dumb enough to leave a digital trail a mile wide. Back at home, I dug through my files and found my original exemption notice from the city. Stamped and signed, legally airtight. Then I pulled up Maple Hollow's HOA charter. Nowhere did it say anything about being able to retroactively add properties or issue environmental fines. And the best part, I remembered something I saw on the city's website months ago, report HOA fraud hotline. I'd bookmarked it, just in case. I grabbed my phone and hit the number. The hotline operator didn't waste time. "Mr. Grady," the voice said after I laid out everything, "we've had multiple tips about unauthorized fee collections in Maple Hollow. You're the first to provide documented proof." I emailed the photos of the forged invoices, my exemption paperwork, and the snapshot of Judith's laptop screen. The operator asked if I'd be willing to speak with an investigator. I said yes before he could finish the sentence. By the next afternoon, I had a call from a city fraud investigator named Keisha Mendoza. She showed up 2 days later in a midnight blue city SUV, clipboard in hand, calm and focused. She wore a badge clipped to her belt and asked sharp, direct questions while walking the perimeter of my property with me. "Do you know how many other residents received these fake invoices?" she asked, stepping carefully around one of my irrigation trenches. I saw at least 6 names on her screen, might be more. "You ever pay one?" Not a cent, but she's been doubling down, keeps tacking late fees onto each new one. Keisha nodded, scribbled something, then pulled out a tablet and showed me a satellite image of the neighborhood. This is the official zoning map. Your property's clearly outside of HOA jurisdiction. She submitted a new version of this map last month, tried to include your land and 2 others. Know anything about that? She mentioned she'd updated the map, I said. Didn't think she was brazen enough to file it with the city. She wasn't. She photoshopped a fake version and mailed it to the assessor's office. Problem is, the file metadata shows it was created on her home computer. She didn't even scrub the user data. That caught my attention. So she's in real trouble: forgery of government documents, wire fraud if she used email, mail fraud if she sent those invoices through the postal system, and if she deposited any checks she collected, bank fraud. I whistled. And here I thought she was just annoying. Keisha cracked a rare grin and said, "Annoying's not a felony, this is." She asked if I'd be willing to wear a wire, said it would help seal the deal. I agreed and invited Judith over that weekend, pretending to be ready to settle things. I spent the next 2 days prepping. Cleaned the porch, mowed the front lawn, even set out a pitcher of lemonade. The goal was to make her comfortable, let her think I was giving in. When she arrived Saturday afternoon, she didn't come alone. She brought her husband, Craig, a lanky man with a permanent scowl and a Bluetooth headset he never seemed to actually use. He stood 5 feet behind her the whole time, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. "I appreciate you coming," I said, guiding them around back where a few chairs were set under my oak tree. Judith sat like she was inspecting a rental property. "So, have you come to your senses about the outstanding balance?" "I want to resolve it," I said, keeping my tone even. "But I need a full breakdown of what I owe, itemized." She opened her binder without hesitation. Inside were printed copies of every fake invoice, plus several new ones I hadn't seen yet. One claimed I owed a livestock maintenance surcharge of $200. Another listed a soil erosion stabilization levy. "Do these have approval from the HOA board?" I asked. "They don't need board approval," she said. "These fall under Executive Environmental Authority." "Is that in the charter?" "It's an emergency clause." I activated it after the last rainstorm. "And these maps you used to include my land, where did those come from?" Craig finally spoke. "They were reviewed by our legal consultant." Keisha, listening from a van down the road, would later note the arrogance in his voice. "He really believed they were untouchable. Can I get a copy of the charter?" I asked. Judith tapped her binder. "You'll get a full packet once you've paid in full. Access to HOA documents is a privilege of members in good standing." I leaned back and said nothing. Let her talk. The longer she did, the deeper the hole she dug. She went on about enforcement rights, how the HOA had unilateral discretion over environmental policy, and how refusal to pay could result in a lien against my property. "Wait," I said. "You're filing liens now. We've started the process. You should expect documentation within the next 2 weeks. But I'm not in the HOA." She gave a thin, satisfied smile. "You are now." That was all Keisha needed. 3 days later, just before dawn, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled into Maple Hollow. I was up feeding the chickens when I saw it 2 cruisers, a black SUV and a city attorney's sedan. They pulled into Judith's driveway like they owned the place. She opened the door in a pink bathrobe and didn't even get a word out before the lead investigator served her with a warrant. Her face turned to stone as they stepped inside. Craig tried to make a scene shouting about unlawful entry and civil overreach, but the officers calmly handed him a second warrant. Turns out his name was on the fake map files too. They'd traced the digital signature back to his work laptop. By the time they finished, both were in cuffs. The HOA garage office was sealed off as evidence. Boxes of fraudulent invoices, a burner phone, and a ledger notebook were all confiscated. The city attorney held a press conference the next day. The charges were stacked high: forgery, mail fraud, wire fraud, attempted property theft, and unauthorized use of public records. They'd collected over $20,000 from other residents using the same fake fees. Worse, They'd attempted to file liens using forged documents. That moved things into felony territory, fast. Residents from all over the neighborhood came forward, most of them retirees or single-income families who'd paid the fees out of fear. No one had questioned the invoices until now. The city froze the HOA's bank accounts, placed the organization under emergency review, and assigned a temporary administrator. A forensic audit was ordered. Judith and Craig were denied bail pending trial. Keisha paid me another visit a week later. She stood at the edge of my porch, watching the goats nibble grass near the fence line. "You did good," she said. "We couldn't have nailed them without you." I asked what would happen to the HOA. "They'll restructure," she said. "Probably dissolve the board entirely. Elect new members under state supervision. Might even dissolve the HOA if enough residents petition." I nodded. "Any chance we can get our original zoning restored, get the city to redraw it properly?" "That's already in motion. Turns out the zoning adjustment that brought the HOA in was sloppy." "Your case opened a few eyes downtown." She handed me a letter, an official exemption renewal, signed by the city planning director. "This one's bulletproof." After she left, I stood on the porch with my dog, Boone, watching the wind move through the trees. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. Later that afternoon, I walked down to my neighbor's place, clutching a folder with all the evidence I'd collected. We called a meeting at the community center. People packed the room. Some were angry, others were just relieved. I handed out copies of the forged documents, explained how to file for restitution. A retired nurse named Helen Bryant stood up and said, "We need to vote them out, all of them." She got a standing ovation. By the end of the week, a petition was circulating to dissolve the current HOA board entirely. Over 70% of the neighborhood signed. Judith's reign was over. 3 weeks after the arrests, Maple Hollow was still trying to figure out how deep the rot went. I'd expected Judith and Craig to be the whole mess, just a couple of petty tyrants with printers and too much time on their hands. But when I got a call from Keisha on a rainy Tuesday morning, I realized we were only halfway down the rabbit hole. "There's something you need to see," she said. "It's bigger than we thought." She picked me up in her city-issued SUV, and we drove to a secure records center near the county courthouse. Inside, under fluorescent lights and rows of locked cabinets, she handed me a manila folder thicker than a seed catalog. Inside were scanned copies of emails, internal notes, and meeting transcripts, all pulled from the seized laptop in Judith's garage office. "They weren't just inventing charges," Keisha said. "They were funneling the money into a private account." But here's the kicker, it wasn't just the two of them. I flipped to the page she'd marked. There, plain as daylight, was an email thread between Craig and a man named Dennis Hall. Dennis had been the HOA's treasurer for nearly a decade. Quiet guy. Always wore faded polo shirts and drove a car so clean it looked factory fresh. I'd seen him exactly twice, both times with a clipboard and a nervous smile. Turns out Dennis had been managing 2 sets of books, one for the HOA's official records, and one for the Environmental Compliance Reserve Fund, which didn't actually exist. It was a front. The fake invoices had been getting routed straight into an account under a shell company registered in Utah. The name, Greenleaf Civic Solutions. "That sound like anything to you?" Keisha asked. I shook my head. "It's fake. No employees, no website, no business license in the state. We traced the corporate registration. It was filed by a lawyer who used to work for the city zoning board. He resigned 6 months ago, right before the revised boundaries were submitted." "So this goes beyond the neighborhood," I said. "Way beyond. We've looped in the state attorney general's office. You lit a fire under something real ugly." Back in Maple Hollow, word was spreading. Most of it came from Helen Bryant, the retired nurse who'd become the unofficial voice of the resistance. She'd organized neighborhood meetings in the old firehouse, and everyone was packed. People brought documents, receipts, even voicemail recordings from HOA board members threatening to escalate fines. At the third meeting, Helen stood up and read a letter aloud from a resident named Marcus Lynn, a veteran who'd lived on the west side of the neighborhood since the 80s. He'd paid over $5,000 in fines over the past year, none of which were legal. He attached scanned copies of the notices, all signed with the same forged signature. Judith Marlowe, environmental officer. People were furious, some were crying, others were pacing. But no one was backing down. A formal petition to dissolve the HOA was gaining traction, and Helen was already working with a municipal attorney to draft a proposal for a community association that would replace one with no power to fine, only to coordinate shared maintenance like snow removal and emergency alerts. That Thursday, I got a knock on my door. It was a man in a navy blazer, mid-40s, with a badge clipped to his belt and a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "Mr. Grady," he said. "I'm Assistant District Attorney Colby Vance. Mind if I come in?" I led him to the kitchen. Boone, my dog, watched him with lazy interest from under the table. Vance opened his portfolio and laid out a single sheet of paper. "We're preparing to file racketeering charges. We believe this qualifies as an organized scheme to defraud under state statute. You're listed as the whistleblower on record." I took a breath. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you'll be called to testify, likely in the preliminary hearing. We've already secured indictments against Judith, Craig, and Dennis. The city zoning lawyer, he's cooperating. Gave us everything." "Anyone else?" He nodded. 3 more HOA board members. They knew about the fake reserve fund, signed off on annual budgets that included those line items. "We're also investigating whether any of them used the money for personal expenses." He handed me a second sheet of preliminary asset freeze order. Boats, second homes, a luxury SUV, even a pair of season tickets with club access to the local football stadium. All of it under scrutiny. "You're going to see news trucks soon," Vance said. "This'll be public." He wasn't kidding. By the weekend, reporters were parked outside the neighborhood entrances. One of them caught me loading hay into the back of my truck and asked if I thought the HOA scandal would shake public trust in community governance. I told her trust isn't the problem. Too much trust is. That's how people like Judith get power in the first place. Everyone just assumes they're doing things by the book. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month. I wore my best flannel shirt, brushed the mud off my boots, and sat in the witness room for over an hour before they called me in. The courtroom was stuffy, and the fluorescent lights made everything feel sterile and distant. But when I sat down behind the microphone and swore to tell the truth, I felt every eye in the room fix on me. The prosecutor asked how I first received the invoice. I explained everything right down to the duct tape on the fence post. I told them about the second invoice, the binder full of made-up charges and the snapshot of the laptop screen. I never looked at Judith, but I could feel her staring. Craig sat motionless beside her. Dennis wouldn't even raise his head. The defense tried to paint it all as a misunderstanding. Creative interpretation of jurisdiction, they called it. But when the judge saw the forged zoning map and the metadata tracing it back to Craig's laptop, he stopped the proceedings and asked for a recess. Afterward, Vance approached me outside the courthouse. "They're going to fold," he said. "We're negotiating a plea. They'll do time." I asked what kind of sentence they were looking at. Fraud convictions on this scale, minimum of 4 years, maybe more depending on restitution. Back in Maple Hollow, the temporary administrator posted a notice. The HOA was officially suspended. No meetings, no fines, no enforcement. Residents were encouraged to attend the dissolution vote scheduled for the following week at the town library. The meeting drew over 200 people. The room hit capacity and folks had to stand in the aisles. The vote wasn't even close. 91% in favor of dissolving the HOA entirely. Afterward, Helen passed around a clipboard for volunteers to help form the new community association. No power over private property, No enforcement officers, just neighbors helping neighbors. I signed up to help review bylaws, mostly to make sure we never ended up in this mess again. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail, real envelope, real stamp. It was from the State Attorney General's office thanking me for my role in exposing the fraud. They included a copy of the updated zoning map, this time signed and notarized with a gold seal at the bottom. My land was clearly marked outside the boundaries. I framed it and hung it in the barn. The farm's been quiet lately. Chickens doing their thing, goats being stubborn, and the tractor still refusing to start. But there's a peace here now that wasn't there before. The kind that comes from knowing the people trying to run your life just got run out of town. And the best part. Judith's house went up for sale last week. No one's made an offer. Word gets around. It was the first Monday of September when the subpoenas dropped. I was patching a section of fence along the east pasture when a black sedan pulled up the gravel drive. A county process server stepped out, holding a yellow envelope with the state seal embossed on the front. He handed it to me with a nod, said I'd be receiving a witness fee, and turned back to his car without another word. Inside the envelope was a trial notice state of redacted VS. Judith Marlowe, Craig Marlowe, Dennis Hall, and 3 additional defendants from the former HOA board. The charges had multiplied since the preliminary hearing. What started out as fraud had evolved into something much darker. The forensic audit Keisha conducted had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Beyond the phony invoices and the shell company, there were financial transactions pointing to unauthorized surveillance purchases. Trail cameras disguised as birdhouses, a drone registered under a fake name, and a license plate scanner mounted under a decorative HOA sign at the neighborhood entrance. The equipment had been used to track non-compliant residents, code speak, for anyone who refused to play along with HOA demands. They'd been monitoring movements, photographing vehicles, and logging visitors, all without warrants or consent. At the time, it hadn't clicked. But I remembered noticing a strange little box on a utility pole near the south corner of my property last spring. I'd assumed it was a city meter. It wasn't. The drone, as it turned out, had been caught in a neighbor's tree after a windstorm. He'd brought it to the HOA's office, thinking it belonged to someone's kid. Craig had thanked him and tossed it in a bin without explanation. When the DA's office traced the drone's flight logs, they discovered it had flown over private property more than 200 times, sometimes at night, sometimes hovering low enough to peek through windows. Several residents had their backyards photographed without ever knowing. That changed everything. The charges now included unlawful surveillance, stalking, and violations of state privacy statutes. Federal investigators got involved when they discovered the surveillance data had been uploaded to a cloud server hosted overseas. That brought in a whole new level of scrutiny. At the pretrial conference, the courtroom looked like something out of a legal drama. Attorneys lined the benches. Reporters packed the back rows. The judge, a woman with a reputation for zero tolerance on abuse of authority, wasted no time setting the tone. "We are not here to debate the merits of homeowners associations," she said. "We are here to address criminal behavior conducted under the guise of community governance." I was called to testify again, this time with more than just invoices in hand. Keisha had provided me with a full printout of the surveillance records linked to my property. One document showed a photo of my barn taken at 2 in the morning. Another recorded the comings and goings of my neighbor's adult son, who visited twice a week to deliver groceries. The defense tried a new angle. "We maintain that these surveillance measures were implemented for the safety of the community," said the lead attorney, a man whose suit looked sharper than his arguments. "There had been reports of trespassing, and the HOA had a duty to protect its residents." The judge leaned forward. "Were these residents informed of the surveillance?" "No, Your Honor, but were any of these measures approved through legal channels?" "No, Your Honor." "Then your argument is irrelevant. Continue." After my testimony, the prosecutor called Helen Bryant to the stand. She spoke softly but clearly, reading from a journal she'd kept over the past year. She described the emotional toll, the anxiety, the confusion, the isolation people felt as they were fined into silence. She read a passage about her late husband, who'd spent the last few months of his life worried they'd lose their home because of mounting fees. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution presented emails, transaction logs, surveillance data, and sworn statements from over 30 residents. The defense attempted to cast it all as a misinterpretation of administrative duties, but their witnesses kept folding under cross-examination. One board member admitted they'd never reviewed the budgets they signed. Another confessed they'd been given cash bonuses to keep things running smoothly. On the final day, the judge allowed each defendant to make a statement. Judith stood, wearing a navy blouse and a rigid expression. She looked older than I remembered, like the weight of her own schemes had finally caught up. "I was trying to improve the neighborhood," she said. "That's all I ever wanted." The judge wasn't moved. "You used that justification to extort your neighbors, violate their privacy, and abuse the trust placed in you. That is not leadership. That is a betrayal." Sentencing was swift. Judith and Craig were each sentenced to 9 years in state prison, with no eligibility for parole for the first 6. Dennis Hall received 7 years, and the remaining 3 board members received between 2 and 4 years depending on their involvement. The plea deals were off the table. The judge wanted an example made. Restitution was ordered in full. Every resident who'd paid a bogus fee was reimbursed from the frozen HOA accounts. The shell company's assets, a cabin in Utah, and a pair of investment portfolios were liquidated and distributed to the victims. But the final blow came from the state legislature. In the wake of the scandal, a new bill was introduced called the Community Oversight and Transparency Act. It required any HOA operating in the state to submit annual reports to a public database, with all board meetings recorded and uploaded within 72 hours. Surveillance of any kind would require unanimous community approval and legal oversight. Maple Hollow was listed as the case that inspired the reform. Back in the neighborhood, things finally started to feel normal again. The old HOA signs were taken down. The security cameras near the entrance were removed. The community association Helen helped organize took root voluntary, open book, no authority beyond organizing potlucks and snowplow schedules. One Saturday, we held a restoration day. Folks brought rakes, paint, and shovels. We cleared overgrown trails, mended fences, and repainted the community bulletin board. Someone brought a grill. Someone else brought lemonade. For the first time in years, people lingered just to talk. I stood beside Helen near the edge of the old HOA office, which had been repurposed into a tool shed for community use. She looked out over the crowd, children playing tag near the creek, an older couple planting flowers near the entrance, and let out a long breath. "Feels different," she said. "Better," I replied. She nodded. "We took something broken and fixed it with our own hands. That's the way it should be." Later that evening, I returned to my farm, tired but content. Boone followed me up the steps and curled near the front door as I settled into the porch chair. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting everything in warm amber. For once, there were no notices taped to my fence. No drones buzzing overhead, no lies hiding behind clipboards and fake titles, just quiet. And the knowledge that when you stand your ground with the truth, with your neighbors at your side, you can bring down even the most stubborn corruption. Justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed.